I have told this story so many times now that I sometimes worry I no longer remember the morning itself, only my own telling of it. But I remember the sound. Before I remember the flags, before the band, before the king's own carriage came around the bend of Harrow High Street, with its 4 gray horses stepping in that unhurried, impossible rhythm they are trained to for years before anyone lets them near a crowd. I remember the sound a truck makes when it is coming down a hill far too fast, driven by no one who has any right to be trusted with it. It is not a scream. It is worse than a scream, because a scream at least tells you that someone inside is still fighting. This was only metal and momentum, and the long tearing groan of brakes that were no longer brakes at all. And by the time I understood what I was hearing, a 5-year-old boy named Rory Fenwick was already 3 steps into the road. I want to tell you the whole of it in order, though, because the sound only means what it means once you understand everything that came before it. Who was standing where, and why, and what kind of man Cormac Reed had spent his whole short life training himself to be, before that morning asked him to become someone else entirely, for 4 seconds, in front of the king. My name is Petra Wynne. I was 38 years old that spring, and I owned a dress shop on Harrow High Street 2 doors up from the corner where Mill Hill comes down into the flat of the town. A narrow shop with a green door and a bow window I had saved 4 years to afford, where I altered wedding gowns and let out the waistbands of christening dresses, and twice a year dressed the mannequin in the window in whatever color the Founding Day Committee had decided the bunting would be that season. That year it was gold and a deep, dignified blue, the colors of the House of Harrowgate, and I had spent the better part of a week sewing yards of ribbon into loops for the awning outside my own door, because a shop on the procession route that did not dress itself for Founding Day was a shop the whole street would remember unkindly. Founding Day is the oldest festival in the Kingdom of Eldermore, older by some accounts than the Crown itself, and it marks the day, some 3 centuries back, when the first stones of the city wall were laid at the bend of the river below what is now the palace at Harrowgate. Every year, King Alaric processions from the palace gates through the heart of the town to the old cathedral at its center, where the bishop reads the founding charter aloud from a lectern worn smooth by 300 years of thumbs, and the king lays a wreath at the base of the founder's column, and the bells ring for exactly as long as it takes the sun to clear the cathedral's eastern tower. It is not, by the standards of state occasions, a dangerous day. There is no delegation of foreign officials to manage, no contested border to gesture toward, no old grief to observe with the particular caution grief requires. It is simply a king riding slowly through his own town on a bright morning while his own people wave flags at him, and for that reason it draws the largest crowds of the year, because it is the one procession where families bring their children and stand for hours without complaint, because nothing frightening ever happens on Founding Day. I want you to hold onto that thought, because I held onto it myself for a long time afterward, the way you hold onto a thing you were taught as a child long after you have proof it isn't true. I had opened the shop early that morning, though I had no real business to conduct. The whole of Harrow High Street would be closed to ordinary trade by 9, roped off in both directions from the fountain at the top of Mill Hill down to the Cathedral Square. But I liked the quiet hour before a festival better than the festival itself, the hour when the bunting is up and the street is swept and nothing has happened yet. I was refilling the window display, a task that mostly consisted of moving the same 3 dress forms 4 inches to the left, when Davin Fenwick knocked on the glass with his son on his shoulders. I had known Davin for going on 6 years by then, since he'd come into the shop not long after he and his wife Alin were married, asking with the particular sheepishness of a young husband whether I could take in a coat that had been his grandfather's, because Alin had told him it made him look like a sack of barley tied in the middle. He was a cooper by trade, one of only 3 left in Harrowgate who still built barrels the old way, by hand, stave by stave, and his forearms showed it. A solid, unhurried sort of man, the kind who says little and means all of it. Elin had died the winter before last, a long illness that the doctors never fully explained to either of us, and that I have no wish to describe further than that, except to say that Davin had come through the other side of it a quieter man than he had been, and that the boy on his shoulders that morning was, by every account I ever heard from anyone who knew them, the entire remaining center of his world. Rory was turning 5 that day. Founding Day was his birthday, an accident of the calendar his mother had always called lucky, because it meant the whole kingdom threw a parade for her son once a year whether it meant to or not, and Davin had kept the joke alive after she was gone, the way a man keeps alive the small things that were never really about the words themselves. He addressed the boy that morning in a little blue coat with brass buttons, an unmistakable echo of a guardsman's tunic that I suspect no one but Davin and I ever noticed, and Rory had a paper flag in one fist, the gold and blue kind the corner shop sold by the 100 that week, already crumpled from being waved too enthusiastically too early. He wanted to say good morning to the dress lady, Davin said, which was Rory's name for me, on account of the mannequins, and Rory leaned down from his father's shoulders and pressed his flag against the glass in a gesture I understood to be a kind of salute. "Good morning to you too, sir," I said through the window, and he beamed the particular unguarded beam of a child who has not yet learned that adults sometimes only pretend to find them delightful. "We're going to see the KingsGuard march," Rory informed me, with the gravity of a man announcing a state visit of his own. "Papa says if I stand very still, they might notice me." "I expect they notice everyone," I said, which was true in a way neither of us understood yet, and Davin laughed and hitched the boy higher on his shoulders and said they'd best get down to the rope line before the good spots went, and I watched them go up the street toward Mill Hill with the particular ache you feel watching a widower and his son manage a birthday together, a mixture of tenderness and worry that I did not examine too closely at the time. Because I had ribbon to hang, and 10 minutes before the crowds would make hanging it impossible. I want to tell you about the guard now, because I had walked past him 100 times without ever really seeing him, the way you walk past a lamppost, and it did not occur to me until much later how strange that was, that a man could stand 8 feet from my shop window 3 or 4 times a year, in scarlet wool and a black bearskin taller than most door frames, and that I could have told you nothing about him at all except that he was there. His name, I would learn, was Cormac Reed, a guardsman of the King's Household Guard, 26 years old that spring, posted that morning not with the marching column but as a fixed sentry at the corner of Mill Hill and Harrow High Street, the exact spot, though none of us knew it yet, where the whole of what mattered that day would eventually collide. Static route sentries are posted at every intersection along a procession route, 100 yards or so apart, standing rope-line duty for hours at a stretch while the crowd builds and thins around them. And of all the guard postings in the kingdom, it is generally reckoned among the dullest, because nothing is expected of a route sentry except that he remain exactly where he is put and prevent the crowd from doing anything foolish near the horses. I did not know that morning that Reed had asked for that posting specifically, had in fact requested it 3 years running, because Mill Hill was the one corner on the route from which, if you turned your head at exactly the wrong angle at exactly the wrong moment, which he was trained never to do, you could see clean up the hill toward the old brewery yards and the goods road beyond, and something in him found comfort in being able to see further than the men posted on the flatter stretches. It was, in hindsight, the single least dull posting on the entire route, though nobody, least of all Reed, understood that yet. He stood that morning, the way every route sentry stands, spine straight as the rope beside him, rifle at the shoulder, chin level, eyes forward and slightly elevated, in the particular unblinking readiness that 4 years of training grinds into a man until it no longer costs him effort to hold it. I had always assumed, in the vague way you assume things about people you have never spoken to, that the stillness was mostly for show, a kind of living statuary the tourists photographed and the rest of us walked past. I did not yet understand that the stillness was not decoration. It was the whole of the job. A route sentry's entire function, the reason the Crown paid for 4 years of a young man's discipline, and then stationed him at a rope line for 6 hours at a stretch, was that in the one moment something actually did go wrong, there would be a trained pair of eyes already in position, already watching, who had not spent the previous 5 hours drifting. By 9:30 the crowd along Harrow High Street was 3 and 4 deep at the rope, thickest at the corners where the road narrowed, and the view down toward the palace gates opened up best. And Mill Hill's corner was among the thickest of all, because it was the last wide vantage before the street bent toward the cathedral square, and the crowd funneled tighter. I had abandoned the shop window by then, and come out to stand on my own step with a cup of tea going cold in my hand, close enough to see Davin and Rory settled at the rope perhaps 30 feet up the hill from where Reed stood his post, Rory perched now on an upturned apple crate someone had left by the corner grocer's, flag recrumpled, eyes fixed up the empty road in the particular painful patience of a child waiting for a parade. The band could be heard from a quarter-mile off before anyone could be seen, the deep processional drum first, then the horns, and the crowd's murmur changed pitch the way a crowd's murmur always does in the last minutes before the thing it has gathered for finally arrives. Brighter, quicker, everyone suddenly straightening, children hoisted onto shoulders all down the street at once as if by some silent signal. I remember thinking, in the ordinary, unremarkable way you think things on ordinary mornings, that it was a fine day for it, bright and a little cool, the kind of sky that photographs well, and that Rory Fenwick was about to have the best birthday of his short life, and that nothing at all was wrong with the world. I had no way of knowing that 2.5 miles away, on the goods road above the brewery yards, a delivery driver named Alden Cobb had woken up 40 minutes late, skipped the breakfast his sister had left out for him, and was already, without knowing it himself yet, in more trouble than he understood. I did not learn any of what follows until the formal inquiry some 6 weeks later, where I sat in the public gallery of the Assize Hall on Cathedral Row with half the town, and listened to it laid out in the flat, careful language that inquiries use, the kind of language that strips all the terror out of a thing, and leaves only the facts standing where the terror used to be. I set it down here as it was given then, because I think it matters, in a story like this one, that you understand Alden Cobb was never anything other than an ordinary, decent, unlucky man having the worst morning of his life, and that nothing that happened afterward was his fault in the way that word usually means fault. He was 34 years old, a drayman for Thorne and Sons Brewers, who had held the goods road route for going on 9 years and had, by every account given at the inquiry, an unblemished record. No accidents, no complaints, a man his foreman described as steady as they come, which is exactly what you want on that hill. He had been diagnosed with a condition of the blood sugar some 4 years before, the ordinary kind that a great many people manage without incident for the whole of their lives, provided they eat when they are meant to eat and take what they are meant to take at the hours they are meant to take it. And Alden Cobb had managed his for 4 years without a single lost morning of work, which was itself a source of quiet pride to him, according to his sister, who kept his house, and who testified at the inquiry with her hands shaking the entire time she spoke. That particular morning he had woken 40 minutes past his alarm, because Founding Day had thrown the whole household's rhythm off a day early. His sister had been up since 4 baking for a stall she kept at the cathedral fair, the kitchen full of the smell of it, and Alden had come downstairs already behind schedule, already irritated with himself in the specific low grade, way a careful man is irritated when his own carefulness has slipped. And he had taken his morning dose standing at the counter with his coat half on, and he had not eaten, because the brewery yard foreman had sent word the night before that the Founding Day delivery schedule was being moved forward an hour on account of every public house, and coaching in Harrowgate wanting their kegs in before the streets closed to wagon traffic. And Alden Cobb, steady as they come, did not want to be the man who held up 9 other drivers on the one morning of the year when the whole town was watching the streets. He would say afterward, and the inquiry accepted it without dispute, that he told himself he would eat something at the yard while the truck was loaded, the way he sometimes did on a rushed morning, and that this had always been enough before. What he did not know, because there was no way for an ordinary man standing in his own kitchen at 5:30 in the morning to know it, was that the dose he had taken on an empty stomach, compounded by the earlier hour and the missed routine, was already beginning to work against him in a way his body would make plain within the hour, gradually and then all at once, in the particular treacherous manner of that condition, where a man can feel almost entirely well for a long stretch and then, in the space of a few minutes, not well at all. The truck itself is a separate part of the story, and I want to be as fair to it as I have tried to be fair to Alden Cobb, because there is a temptation, once you know how a thing ends, to hunt backward through everything that came before it for someone to blame. And the honest answer the inquiry reached, after 3 days of testimony from mechanics and yard foremen and the brewery's own safety officer, was that no single person was to blame for what the brakes did that morning, only a chain of small, forgivable delays that know one thing about, but which came together right, or rather, right at the beginning of it wrong. The truck was a heavy flatbed drayage lorry built to carry loaded kegs down off the goods road, a route that dropped some 400 feet in under 2 miles before it leveled out into the flat streets of the town, the steepest sustained grade of any delivery road in the kingdom, by the brewery's own reckoning, which was why Thorne and Sons kept 2 mechanics on permanent staff and serviced the brake systems of the goods fleet on a schedule stricter than the law required. 9 days before Founding Day, a junior mechanic named Petz had flagged a soft spot in the rear brake line of the very lorry Alden Cobb would drive that morning. Not a failure, nothing so obvious as a failure, only a give in the pedal that oughtn't have been there, the kind of thing a careful mechanic notices and a careless one waves through. Petz had written it up. The truck had been scheduled for the line to be replaced. And then Founding Day had arrived on the calendar the way it always did, with every public house in Harrowgate wanting double its usual order in the space of 4 days. And the yard foreman, a decent man named Hallow who broke down twice on the stand describing it, had looked at 9 drays booked solid through Founding Day morning, and one flagged for a repair that would take the truck off the road for the better part of a day, and had made the calculation that thousands of ordinary, decent, harried people make every week of their working lives, that the truck could run 1 more week on a soft pedal and go into the shop the Tuesday after, when the festival traffic had cleared. I do not say any of this to excuse what came afterward, because nothing needs excusing. No one broke a law, no one behaved with anything but ordinary human fallibility, and the inquiry's final finding used almost exactly that phrase. I say it because I think people who hear this story secondhand, in the version that gets told at dinner tables and passed on again after that, tend to imagine a villain somewhere in it, a reckless man behind the wheel of a truck he shouldn't have been driving, and there was no such man. There was only a tired, hungry, unlucky man named Alden Cobb, doing the same job he had done without incident for 9 years, in a truck with a brake line that had another 11 days of ordinary service left in it before it would have been fixed, if that morning had been like every other morning that had come before it. It was not like every other morning. I want to bring you back now to Harrow High Street, because while all of that was assembling itself, mile by mile, out of sight of every one of us, the procession had begun. I heard the king before I saw him, which is how it always is on Founding Day. The drum first, low and even, then the horns picking up the same slow processional air the royal band has played at the head of that parade for longer than anyone now living can remember. And then, cresting the rise where Harrow High Street bends up out of the palace grounds, the outriders came into view, 6 of the king's household guard on matched gray horses, and behind them the open carriage itself. Gold-trimmed and drawn by the same 4 grays I mentioned before, and in it, King Alaric in the plain dark blue coat he always wore for founding day rather than the ceremonial red, because, so the story went, and I believe it, having seen the man myself on more than one occasion. He considered founding day a day that belonged to the town and not to the crown, and dressed accordingly. The crowd's noise changed the moment the carriage came into view, the way I told you it always does, brighter and higher all at once, and I watched it move down the street from my own step the way you watch weather come in, a kind of visible front of raised arms and lifted children and flags going up on both sides of the road, in a ragged, cheerful wave that chased the carriage's own pace down the hill. Rory Fenwick, 30 feet up from me at the rope by Reed's corner, went up onto his father's shoulders again, flag already going, and even at that distance I could hear him shouting something that might have been the king's name or might have been nothing at all, the way small children shout simply because the noise in them has to go somewhere. I want to tell you what I understood about Cormac Reed in that moment, watching him from my step, because I have turned it over many times since, and I believe it is the truest thing I can say about what happened later. He did not move. Of course he did not move. That was the entire function of him, as I've explained, but I mean something more particular than that. Every other person on that street, myself included, had their attention pulled toward the carriage the instant it appeared, the whole avenue of us turning like a field of something turning toward the sun. Reed's eyes did not follow it. He held his post at the exact angle he had held it for the 2 hours prior, chin level, gaze fixed on the middle distance of the crowd across from him, and it was only because I happened to be looking directly at him. I could not have told you why, except that something about a man who does not turn his head when 3,000 other people are turning theirs draws the eye precisely, because it is the one still point in a moving picture, that I saw the very small thing he did do, which was to let his eyes drop for perhaps half a second up the slope of Mill Hill behind him, before returning to their fixed post directly ahead. It was not disobedience. It was not even, I think, a deliberate choice in the way we usually mean that word. It was 4 years of training doing exactly what 4 years of training is meant to do in a man, which is to notice, in the smallest possible register, that something in the periphery of a scene has changed, before the conscious mind has caught up enough to say what. I did not think anything of it. I want to be honest about that. I had a cup of tea going cold in my hand, and a king's carriage 40 yards up the street, and a 5-year-old boy in a paper flag shouting his lungs raw, and a guardsman's eyes flicking half an inch and back again, was not the kind of thing that registers as anything at all, in the ordinary run of a bright festival morning. It was only afterward, turning the whole of it over the way you do, that I understood he had heard something the rest of us hadn't yet. Not the truck itself, not at that distance, not over the band and the crowd and the ring of hooves on cobblestone, but some change in the quality of the noise coming down off the goods road, the particular pitch a heavy vehicle makes on a steep grade when the engine is being asked to do work the brakes ought to be doing instead. A sound that means nothing to a woman running a dress shop and meant, to a soldier's trained ear, that something up that hill was already wrong. 200 yards behind me, unseen by any of us, Alden Cobb came over the crest where the goods road meets the top of Mill Hill, fully loaded, running some 4 minutes behind his own schedule, sweating in a way the cool morning did not account for, and felt, for the first time that day, a soft and swimming unsteadiness pass behind his eyes that he would later describe to the inquiry, in a voice I still remember, as like watching the road through water. He reached for the brake pedal at the top of the grade the way he had 10,000 times before in 9 years on that route, an unthinking, practiced motion, and the pedal went down further than it should have, and kept going. None of us on Harrow High Street knew any of that yet. I want to hold you there a moment, in the last few minutes before anyone did, because I think it is important to understand how ordinary everything still felt, how completely the morning still belonged to Rory Fenwick and his birthday parade and nothing else. The king's carriage had reached the flat stretch of the high street by then, perhaps 60 yards below Mill Hill's corner, and closing at the same unhurried walking pace it always kept, the four greys stepping in that trained, deliberate rhythm, and the crowd along that stretch was doing what crowds along that stretch always did, calling out blessings and good wishes, a few of the bolder children darting to the very edge of the rope to wave. The king himself lifting a hand now and again to this side, or that of the street in the economical, unforced way I had watched him do at a dozen founding days before that one. He was, by every account I have ever heard from anyone who has stood near him, an unshowy man in person, quieter than the paintings suggest, and that morning he wore the look he always wore on that particular ride through his own town, which I can only describe as contentment. The look of a man doing a thing he has done every year of his adult life, and finding that he still likes it. I had drifted a little way up the street from my own step by then, tea abandoned on the windowsill, drawn the way everyone is drawn toward the place where the carriage will actually pass closest. And so I had a clearer view than before of the corner where Reed stood, and the rope where Davin and Rory Fenwick waited, close enough now that I could see the boy's flag had gone soft and gray at the folds from all his waving, and that Davin had one steadying hand on his son's ankle where it hung down over his shoulder, the unconscious grip of a father who has already, once in his life, learned what it costs to lose something you thought was permanent. It was around this time, by Reed's own testimony at the inquiry, that he first understood with real certainty that something was wrong up the hill behind him. He described it, when the inquiring officer asked him to, with a soldier's precision that I found more chilling in its plainness than any dramatic account could have been. He said that a route sentry learns the ordinary sounds of his own posting the way, a man learns the ordinary sounds of his own house, which is to say, without ever consciously studying them, simply by standing in the same place long enough that the pattern of a place becomes part of him. Mill Hill's ordinary sounds, on an ordinary morning, were the creak and clop of goods carts coming down at a walking pace, sometimes a delivery van in low gear with its engine held back against the grade, always slow, always controlled, because every driver who used that road knew what the grade demanded of a vehicle and drove accordingly. What he heard now, faint still, distant still, but rising, was an engine working far harder than the grade should have required of it, revving up rather than holding back, the sound of a driver trying to use the engine itself to check a speed the brakes were no longer checking, and beneath it, a thin metallic shriek that came and went as brake pads that had already begun to overheat and glaze made intermittent, useless contact with a drum they could no longer properly grip. He said he knew, in the way a trained man knows a thing before he has fully assembled the reasons for knowing it, that it was not the sound of a controlled vehicle. He said he did not yet know it was going to matter to anyone but the driver. This is the part of the story I have thought about longest, in all the times I have told it since, because it is the part where Cormac Reed did something that I think very few people, guard or otherwise, would have managed to do, and it had nothing to do with running or lifting or any of the things that came after. What he did was nothing at all. He held his post. The king's carriage was, by that point, perhaps 40 yards from his position in closing, and every fiber of 4 years' training told him that the single worst thing a route sentry could do, in the final seconds before the sovereign passed his post, was to break bearing and draw attention to himself for a threat that might, even now, resolve itself into nothing. A driver who would find his footing, a hill that had claimed no one in living memory, an engine note that a jumpier man might have imagined worse than it was. He had been trained, explicitly and repeatedly, that a sentry who broke formation on a false alarm in front of the sovereign was a sentry who had failed at the one job he existed to do, because the entire value of 100 still, disciplined men along a royal route was that their stillness told the crowd, wordlessly and constantly, that nothing was wrong. A sentry who moved without cause was worse than useless. He was an alarm bell rung for nothing, in the one setting where a false alarm could cause exactly the kind of crush and panic that the discipline was meant to prevent in the first place. So he stood. He told the inquiry this plainly, without excusing it and without needing to, because nothing about it required excuse. Every officer who testified after him agreed that his judgment in that half-minute had been exactly correct, that a sentry who bolted at the first uncertain sound would be a sentry no one could ever trust again. He stood at his post with his rifle at his shoulder and his eyes forward and the sound climbing behind him, and he did the one thing his training did permit him, which was to widen, by the smallest possible margin, the field of what he was watching, not his head, never his head, but his attention, so that the empty mouth of Mill Hill above the crowd's heads sat now at the very edge of everything he was tracking, waiting for the moment when uncertainty would become certainty, and duty would change shape entirely. I did not know any of this was happening. I want to be honest about that too. I stood in the ordinary press of the crowd with the king's carriage passing directly below me now, close enough that I could see the particular gray of his hair at the temple and the plain gold band he wore, no different from any other year. And I remember thinking, with the small, unimportant vanity of a shopkeeper, that I hoped he would glance toward my window with its ribbon and its two dressed mannequins. And he did not, of course. Because a king processing through his own town on Founding Day has several thousand windows to not particularly notice, and I remember laughing quietly at myself for minding. Rory Fenwick, on his father's shoulders 30 feet from me, was doing what every child on that street was doing, which was shrieking the word king in the specific unrestrained register that only small children have, over and over, delighted simply by the size of the occasion, by the horses, by the gold on the carriage, by his own place at the very front of a crowd that stretched back further than he could yet understand how to measure. He had, Davin told me much later, spotted Reed himself sometime in the previous quarter hour, a 5-year-old boy's fascination fixing, the way it does, not on the king in his carriage but on the nearer, stiller, stranger figure of a soldier who did not move at all, whom Rory had apparently decided, with a child's flat and total logic, must be some kind of statue that had been brought out especially for the day. An idea Davin had not corrected, because it delighted him too much to hear his son argue about it with the boy beside them at the rope. "He's not a statue," the other boy insisted, and Rory, from his perch on his father's shoulders, said with enormous confidence, "He is today," and Davin laughed out loud, a real laugh, the kind he had not laughed as often as he once had, and neither of them had the faintest idea that the man they were discussing had, at that exact moment, gone from 90% certain to entirely certain that a vehicle he could not yet see was coming down Mill Hill with no brakes left to stop it. It crested the rise a few seconds later, and then everyone could hear it. I have heard people who were further back in the crowd say afterward that they thought at first it was some part of the pageant, a stray cart, a mishap with the band's equipment wagon, nothing that concerned them, because nothing on Founding Day had ever concerned anyone before. I did not make that mistake because I was close enough, and because I saw Cormac Reed's head turn, fully and at last, away from the king's carriage and up the slope of Mill Hill behind him, and something in the totality of that motion, a man who had not moved his head in 2.5 hours, turning it now, all the way in a single decisive sweep, told me before the sound itself fully registered that whatever was coming was not part of any pageant at all. The truck came over the crest of Mill Hill at a speed no delivery vehicle had any business carrying on that grade, listing very slightly, its horn beginning to sound in short, desperate, useless blasts, and I understood in the same instant that everyone around me understood it, in the great collective intake of breath that runs through a crowd in the half-second before it becomes a crowd in trouble, that the truck was still gathering speed. that the road ahead of it ran straight down into the exact corner where the king's carriage and several thousand of his subjects, and one small boy in a paper flag and blue coat with brass buttons were all, at that moment, standing directly in its path. What happened in the next handful of seconds happened, from where I stood, all at once and out of order, the way real danger nearly always does, so that I have had to rebuild the sequence of it afterward out of my own memory and Davin's and Reed's own testimony, laid end to end like a fence put up after the field has already flooded. The outriders reacted first, and they reacted well, exactly as their own years of training meant they would. I saw the lead rider wheel his horse hard across the road just above the king's carriage, cutting the angle, while two others closed in tight on either flank of the carriage itself, and the coachman, without waiting for any order at all, hauled the four grays into a sharp turn down the narrow lane beside the old corn exchange, off the main street entirely and out of the truck's line, the whole maneuver done in perhaps 4 seconds with a discipline that I have thought about nearly as much since as anything Cormac Reed did that morning, though it is never the part of the story anyone wants to hear. The king himself, I was told afterward by men who stood closer to the carriage than I did not so much as raise his voice, only gripped the rail of his own seat and let his men do the work they had trained their whole lives to do, and within those same 4 seconds the carriage was clear, around the corner and out of danger, and the crown of Eldermore was never, at any point that morning, in any real peril at all, a fact the newspapers made a great deal less of in the weeks that followed than the fact that it very nearly had been. But the crowd did not know, in that first instant, that the carriage would clear. The crowd only knew that a runaway vehicle the size of a small house was coming down on top of several thousand people standing shoulder to shoulder at a rope line, and a crowd that believes that, however briefly, does not behave like an orderly gathering of individuals. It behaves like water finding the nearest low ground, and on Harrow High Street that morning, the nearest low ground was backward, away from the road, into itself, a great compressive surge of bodies that knocked more than one person off their feet and swept others sideways with no regard at all for who was standing where. I was caught in the edge of it myself, jostled hard enough that I lost my footing for a moment and had to catch the door frame of the shop beside me to stay upright, and it was only because I had that frame to hold, and because I had, by pure chance, kept my eyes fixed up the street toward the Fenwicks rather than turning to save myself the way every instinct told me to, that I saw what happened to Davin. He had Rory on his shoulders still when the surge hit, both hands up around the boy's ankles the way he had held him the whole morning, and I watched him do the thing any father would do, which was brace himself against the crush of bodies behind him and try to hold his ground rather than be carried backward with the crowd, because backward in that moment meant deeper into a press of panicking strangers with a small child riding above all their heads where a stumble could throw him. It was, I believe to this day, exactly the right instinct. It was also, through no fault of his own, the instinct that put Rory in danger, because a man bracing hard against a crowd with both hands locked around his son's ankles is a man who cannot, in the same instant, also keep a firm grip on a frightened 5-year-old who has just felt the ground lurch beneath his father's feet and heard, all around him, several thousand adults make a sound children are never meant to hear grown men and women make. Rory did what I have since learned from a physician who spoke at the inquiry about the behavior of young children in sudden crowd panic, is a genuinely common and heartbreakingly counterintuitive response. He did not cling tighter to the one steady thing he had. He panicked towards stillness. In the chaos of adult bodies surging and shouting all around him, the only fixed point left in the whole of his vision was the one figure on that street who was not moving at all, who had stood in the same spot the entire morning, while a boy on a crate had decided, with a 5-year-old's flat and total certainty, that he must be some kind of statue brought out especially for the day, safe, unmoving, permanent, everything the rest of the street had just stopped being. Rory wriggled hard against his father's grip, and Davin, both hands full of a bracing crowd and a boy fighting to get down, felt him slip rather than let go. The particular helpless motion of a small body sliding free between fingers that were doing everything they could and were not, in that half-second, enough. I saw the boy hit the ground on his feet, stumble once, and run, not away from the road, not back into the crowd where every grown instinct would have carried him, but forward, 3 steps forward, ducking clean under the low rope where the crush of the crowd had already knocked one of the corner stanchions half over, running as fast as his legs would carry him toward the one still, safe, permanent thing left in a world that had, in the space of 5 seconds, come entirely undone around him. "Rory!" I heard Davin shout it, a sound I do not think I will ever fully stop hearing when I let myself remember that morning, but he was 3 strides back in the crush by then, fighting bodies that would not simply part for him the way bodies part in a story, real bodies, panicking and solid and in his way, and I watched a young man near him reach out and try to catch the boy's arm as he passed and miss it by a hand's width, and I understood, watching it. In the particular sick clarity that comes over you when you finally see a thing clearly and can do nothing at all about it, that no one on that street was close enough, or fast enough, or lucky enough, to reach Rory Fenwick before the truck did. No one except the one man, who was already exactly where he needed to be. I want to tell you now what I actually saw, because I have heard other versions of this told since, embellished the way any dramatic story gets embellished in the retelling, and I would rather give you the plainer, truer thing, because the plainer, truer thing does not need embellishing. Cormac Reed had watched the truck crest the hill with the same flat, assessing attention he had given the empty road above it for 2.5 hours, already running the calculation every route sentry is drilled to run in the half-second such a thing becomes possible, trajectory, speed, the width of the road, the position of the crowd, the position of the carriage, who was closest to the line the vehicle would take if nothing changed. He had clocked the outriders wheeling the King clear within the first second, filed it, and moved on, because a King 200 feet away and pulling clear was no longer his concern. A route sentry's post was his post, and everything in it was. He had seen the crowd surge and braced instinctively against it himself, one boot planted wide the way his training told him to, rifle still at his shoulder, still, even then, holding the line his post demanded of him, because the truck's path, by his own reckoning in that instant, was going to carry it into the corner rope and very possibly into the crowd bunched against it. And every second he held his exact position was a second he remained useful to whatever came next. And then he saw the boy in the blue coat with the brass buttons come out from under the rope, 3 steps into the open road, running straight toward him. He told the inquiry that he did not remember making a decision. He said this carefully, and the inquiring officer pressed him on it twice, because an inquiry likes decisions, likes to be able to point to the moment a man weighed his duty against his instinct and chose, and Reed would not give them that moment because, in his own account, there had not been one. There had only been the boy, and the truck, and the very small distance between them closing at a speed that left no room at all for the 4 years of training that had taught him, above every other lesson it had ever taught him, to stay exactly where he was. He was already moving before the thought finished forming. That is the whole of what he told them, and it is, I believe, the truest and most complete answer anyone gave at that entire inquiry, to the question of what makes a man become, for 4 seconds, someone entirely different from the man he has spent his whole career training himself to be. I saw the rifle go first. It is a strange thing to remember clearly out of 4 seconds of chaos, but I remember it precisely, because it was so wholly unlike anything I had ever seen a guardsman do. The rifle simply gone from his shoulder, flung clear and clattering against the cobbles behind him, because a man cannot run the way Cormac Reed needed to run in the next 2 seconds with 14 pounds of ceremonial rifle held at the port, and some deep, correct instinct in him understood that and discarded it without a flicker of hesitation. the single most valuable piece of equipment the Crown had issued him, treated, in that instant, as no more than a thing in his way. He crossed the distance to Rory Fenwick in what the inquiry's own reconstruction, built from 3 separate witness sightlines, and the testimony of a royal engineer who measured the ground itself afterward, put at just under 2 seconds, a sprint of some 11 strides that I am told, by men who understand these things better than I do, is very close to what a trained man's body can physically produce, and very little more. As though Cormac Reed had spent 4 years storing up a single piece of speed, he never knew he possessed until the one morning he needed the whole of it at once. I did not see it as a measured, mechanical thing, the way the inquiry's diagrams later made it look, all straight lines and calculated angles. I saw a man in scarlet and black cross an open road at a dead run with his arms already opening, and I saw the boy, still running, still 3 strides from where the front of that truck would have reached him, look up at the last possible instant and see, not a monster bearing down on him, but the one still, safe thing on the whole street finally moving toward him instead of standing apart from him. And I have thought, every single time I have told this story since, that there was something almost unbearably tender in that half-second, a frightened child running toward what he believed was safety, and safety, at the very last, actually arriving. Reed did not slow to gather him gently. There was no time left for gentleness, and I want to be plain about that, because gentleness is not what saved Rory Fenwick that morning, though a great deal of gentleness came afterward. He hit the boy at a dead run the way a man tackles another man on a playing field, one arm scooping low and hard under Rory's legs, the other wrapping fast around his back and head, and the whole of his own considerable weight and speed carried them both off the ground and sideways, out of the truck's line, in a single continuous motion that ended with Cormac Reed turning his own body in the air so that, when the two of them came down, it was his shoulder and his back that struck the cobblestones first, and Rory Fenwick who landed, entirely unhurt, cradled against his chest. The truck passed the exact spot where the boy had been standing perhaps 3/4 of a second later. I have tried, in every telling of this story I have ever given, to find some way to describe the sound of it going by that does justice to how close it truly was, and I have never managed it, because the honest truth is that it does not sound, in the retelling, nearly as close as it looked from where I stood, not 15 feet away, watching a king's guardsman and a 5-year-old boy tumble together across the cobbles, while a wall of metal thundered past them close enough that I felt the wind of its passing lift the hem of my own skirt. Alden Cobb, in the last conscious seconds available to him, did the one thing that likely kept that morning from becoming an altogether different story. He had felt the world go gray and distant around the edges in the moments before, his hands still locked on a wheel he could barely feel anymore, and by his own account, given haltingly at the inquiry, the last clear thought he had before his vision closed in entirely was not of himself at all, but of the crowd he could see filling the whole width of the road ahead of him, and he wrenched the wheel, with whatever strength was left in him, away from the thickest press of people, and toward the empty run of pavement in front of the shuttered ironmongers on the corner, a decision made in the final half-second of his own awareness, before his body slid sideways in the seat, and the truck, no longer steered by anyone at all, carried its own momentum straight into the low stone horse trough that had stood on that corner, by the town's own reckoning, for over 100 years. The trough took the impact the way stone takes such things. It did not so much as crack, though the truck's front axle buckled hard against it, and the whole vehicle came to a stop so sudden and so violent that 2 of the loaded barrels on its bed tore free of their restraints and burst apart across the cobblestones in a wide, foaming, spreading wash of pale ale that would, by the time the street was cleared an hour later, have become the single detail every child on Harrow High Street remembered best about the whole event, the great unexpected flood of beer running down the gutter toward the fountain while their parents wept and embraced each other over their heads. For a moment after the crash there was no sound at all, or none that I remember, the particular ringing silence that follows a great noise, in which a whole street seems to hold its breath together, waiting to learn what it has just witnessed. Then Davin Fenwick was through the crowd, shoving past people who parted for him, now the way they had not been able to a moment before, and he went down on his knees on the cobblestones beside Cormac Reed, and his son with a sound I have never forgotten, somewhere between a sob and his son's name said over and over, and Rory, entirely unhurt, scraped at one elbow and utterly bewildered by the sudden violent turn his birthday parade had taken, looked up at his father's face, and then at the guardsman still curled protectively around him, and said, in the small, wondering voice of a child working out something enormous, "You're not a statue." Reed did not answer him at once. I was close enough by then to see why. He was breathing hard, one arm still braced beneath the boy though the danger had entirely passed, and there was a long, shallow graze along his jaw where the cobbles had caught him, and beneath the torn shoulder of his scarlet tunic I could see, even from where I stood, the beginning of a bruise that would, I learned later, turn the better part of his upper arm a deep and painful purple for the better part of a fortnight. The physical bill for a body that had been trained for 4 years to stand perfectly still, and had just, in the space of 4 seconds, done the single most violent and unrehearsed thing it had ever been asked to do. Nothing about him was seriously hurt. The palace surgeon who examined him within the hour found a strained shoulder, the graze, the bruising, and nothing more. A fact I have always found remarkable given what his body had just been asked to survive, and which the surgeon herself put down, in words I have never forgotten, to a young man built by 4 years of discipline to fall correctly, even when nothing about the moment gave him time to think about falling at all. What he said to Rory, when he finally found breath enough to say anything, was not grand, and I think that is exactly why it has stayed with everyone who has ever heard it repeated. He looked down at the boy still gathered against his chest, and he said, "Not today, I suppose," and something in the plainness of it, the dry, almost apologetic humor of a man who had just broken every rule he had ever been given and did not yet know what it would cost him, undid the whole street at once. People who had been standing in frightened silence a moment before began, all up and down Harrow High Street, to weep and to cheer in the same breath, a sound I have never heard before or since, joy and terror discharging themselves together out of several thousand throats at once, and somewhere in the middle of it, Davin Fenwick took his son from Cormac Reed's arms and then, astonishingly, would not let go of the guardsman either, one arm wrapped around each of them. Kneeling on the cobblestones in the wreckage, and the spilled ale with the 2 people who mattered most to him in the whole of that moment held against him at once. I stood where I was and I did not move for a long time, because I could not entirely trust my legs yet, and I watched the crowd close in around the 3 of them in a way that was gentle rather than crushing this time, people reaching out simply to touch Reed's shoulder or Rory's hair as they passed, the way you touch a thing to prove to yourself it is really there. Somewhere behind me, up toward the Corn Exchange, I could hear the king's own voice for the first time that morning, raised and urgent, asking to be told at once what had happened and whether the boy was safe. And I understood, hearing it, that the day was not yet over, that everything that had just happened on that street had happened in full view of the Crown's own household guard, in the middle of the Crown's own procession, and that a sentry who had thrown down his rifle and abandoned his post in front of the king himself was about to discover that saving a life and answering for how he had saved it were, in the world Cormac Reed had chosen to serve, 2 very separate reckonings. King Alaric came around the corner from the Corn Exchange on foot some 90 seconds later. Having left the carriage and his outriders behind the moment, he understood the danger had passed, and a child was involved. And I want to tell you honestly that I have never before or since seen a king move the way he moved through that crowd, not with any particular hurry, because a hurried king in a frightened crowd is its own kind of danger. But with a directness that parted people more surely than any amount of shouting could have, every person he passed simply stepping back and going quiet, until he came to the wet, ale-soaked corner where Davin Fenwick still knelt with his arms around his son and the guardsman who had saved him. He crouched down. I remember that most of all, out of everything that happened in the minutes after the crash. The King of Eldermore in his plain dark blue coat, going down on one knee on cobblestones running with spilled ale to bring his own face level with a scraped, bewildered 5-year-old boy, and asking him, in a voice gentle enough that I only caught the shape of it and not the words, whether he was hurt. Rory, I am told, considered the question with enormous seriousness, examined his own scraped elbow, and announced that he was fine but that his flag had been lost in the crash, a piece of news that seemed to distress him rather more than anything else that had happened that morning. And the king, and this is the detail Davin has told at every dinner table in Harrowgate at least 100 times since, reached into his own coat and produced, from an inside pocket, a small enamel pin in the shape of the founder's column that he had been wearing since before the procession began, and gave it to the boy in place of the flag, telling him that a pin, unlike a flag, could not be lost in a crash a second time, because it would live in his pocket from then on. Only once he had satisfied himself that the boy was truly unharmed did the king rise and turn his attention to the man still kneeling beside him, and it was here, I think, that the true shape of what was coming first became visible to anyone watching closely, because King Alaric's face, which had been warm and unguarded with Rory, went carefully, deliberately neutral as he looked at Cormac Reed. In the particular way I have since learned is the face of any head of an institution who understands that what he says next, in front of several thousand witnesses, will matter a great deal more than what he privately feels. "You left your post," the king said. It was not an accusation exactly, or not only an accusation. Davin told me afterward that the tone of it had been almost unreadable, flat and considering, the tone of a man laying a fact on a table to see what would be built on top of it. "I did, Your Majesty," Reed said. He was on his feet by then, at attention despite the graze on his jaw and the arm he was visibly favoring, and I have always found it remarkable, hearing it described, that a man who had just done the single most extraordinary thing anyone on that street had ever witnessed offered no argument at all in his own defense, no explanation, nothing but the plain admission of the charge, because that, too, was what 4 years of training had built into him. That a guardsman does not excuse himself to his sovereign, he answers for himself and lets the answer be judged. "You discarded your rifle." "I did, Your Majesty." "Do you understand?" the king said, and here, Davin told me, something did finally move behind his composure, though it was gone again almost as soon as it appeared, "that I cannot simply thank you for this, however much I might wish to, standing here. There is a process. There are men whose whole purpose is to ask whether a sentry who breaks his post over what looks, in the moment, like danger to a child, might one day break his post over something that only looks that way. And if we do not let that question be asked properly, in the open, we will have taught every guardsman in my service that the line can be crossed whenever his own judgment tells him to cross it. And I promise you, Guardsman Reed, that is a lesson that will get someone killed one day, even if it saves someone today." I did not hear any of this myself in the moment. I have pieced it together since, from Davin, and from Reed himself much later, and from the inquiry's own record, which quoted the exchange nearly verbatim from 3 independent witnesses close enough to hear it. Because it turned out the king had not troubled to lower his voice, and I have always believed that was deliberate, that a king who wanted the whole street to understand exactly what price a guardsman might pay for saving a child would say so plainly enough for the whole street to hear it. What I did see, from where I stood, was Cormac Reed taken away not 10 minutes later by 2 officers of his own regiment, walking beside him rather than escorting him, though the distinction would have been lost on no one watching, and I remember the crowd's confusion curdling into something close to anger. A low, unhappy murmur running up and down Harrow High Street at the sight of the man who had just thrown himself under a runaway truck for a stranger's child being led away like a man under suspicion of something. And I remember thinking, with the particular helpless frustration of a bystander who understands a thing and cannot change it, that the world had just shown me, in the space of 10 minutes, both the very best and the most maddening thing about the discipline these men live inside. That the same iron structure which had built Cormac Reed into a man capable of covering 11 strides and 2 seconds of open road to save a child's life was now, without any apparent contradiction to the men enforcing it, prepared to take him apart for having done it. The following 6 weeks were, by every account I gathered afterward, the hardest of Cormac Reed's young life, harder in their own quiet way than the 4 seconds that made them necessary. He was suspended from active posting pending the inquiry, which was standard procedure, and his own superiors told him plainly, no reflection at all on how the matter was likely to resolve, but standard procedure, when you are 26 years old and have built the whole of your adult identity around a uniform, does not feel like a technicality. It feels like being told to sit very still in a small room while other men decide whether the last 4 years of your life added up to anything. He was not permitted to speak publicly about what had happened, which meant he could not so much as walk down Harrow High Street without drawing a crowd of well-wishers he was forbidden to properly thank. And Davin told me that in the whole of that 6 weeks, Reed came to the Fenwick house exactly twice, both times after dark, both times declining to come further than the doorstep, because he had convinced himself, in the peculiar guilty logic of a man waiting on judgment, that it was somehow improper to accept a grateful family's warmth, while his own service still hung in question. I saw him myself perhaps a dozen times in that stretch, always alone, always walking with the particular careful bearing of a man trying very hard to look like nothing at all was wrong, and I confess that I did something during those 6 weeks that I had never done for any guardsman in all the years I had walked past them without truly seeing them. I began leaving a cup of tea on the low sill outside my shop window most mornings, at roughly the hour I knew, from asking around discreetly. That he tended to walk that stretch of the street on his way to, or from whatever quiet errands filled his suspended days. I never once saw him take it. But the cup was always empty by midday, and I choose to this day to believe that was him and not some passing stranger, because I think a man in that particular kind of limbo needs to know, in whatever small way a town can tell him, that the town has not forgotten what he did while it waits to find out what will be done to him for doing it. The newspapers in those first days did what newspapers do with a story too good to leave alone, and I want to set down honestly that not all of what they did was kind, even though the town's own feeling ran entirely the other way. The Harrowgate Courier ran the story fairly and well, with an illustration of the corner at Mill Hill that hung, framed, in more shop windows along that street than I could easily count, my own included. But a paper down from the capital, with no particular loyalty to Harrowgate or any of the people actually living through what it was reporting on, ran a piece within the week that asked, in a headline I still remember with a small flare of the old anger, whether a guardsman who would abandon his sovereign's side on a private impulse ought to be trusted with a rifle at all. And for 2 or 3 days that piece traveled further and faster than the truth of the matter ever seemed able to catch it. Davin told me later that he had gone, unannounced and entirely uninvited, to that paper's own offices in the capital, a journey of the better part of a day each way that he made and returned from within a single stretch of daylight because he refused to leave Rory for a night, and had stood in their front office until an editor agreed to see him, and had said, more or less, what he later said under oath at the inquiry, and the paper printed a correction inside the week. Tucked well back from where the original piece had run, which is the way of such things, though Davin told me he had not gone there expecting fairness so much as needing, for his own peace, to have said it to someone whose job it was to have gotten it wrong, Rory himself, in those first weeks, did not speak of the truck at all, which worried Davin a good deal more than if the boy had spoken of nothing else. He slept poorly for a stretch, waking twice in the same week with a fright he could not or would not put words to, and it was only when Davin, at his wit's end, and following the advice of the same physician who had examined Reed, arranged for the two of them to see each other once, quietly, away from any crowd or any of the attention that had followed both of them since founding day, that whatever had lodged itself in the boy seemed to come loose. Reed came to the cooperage on a gray afternoon in his own clothes rather than his uniform, sat on an overturned barrel in Davin's workshop for the better part of an hour, and let Rory ask him, in the boy's own halting way, all the questions a 5-year-old has no other outlet for asking. Whether it had hurt, whether he had been afraid, whether the truck was going to come back. Reed answered every one of them honestly, Davin told me, including the one that mattered most, which was that yes, for about as long as it takes to blink, he had been afraid, and that being afraid and doing the thing anyway was not two different choices but the same choice, made at the same time, which I have always thought was as fine, and as true a thing as I have ever heard one person say to a frightened child. Rory slept through the night for the first time in 9 days after that visit, and did not wake frightened again. I want to tell you, too, about a conversation I had with Cormac Reed myself during those 6 weeks, because it is the only real conversation of any length the two of us ever had before the inquiry concluded, and it has stayed with me longer than almost anything else in this whole account. He came into my shop on an ordinary Tuesday, not for the tea I had taken to leaving on the sill. He never once in 6 weeks acknowledged that cup to me directly, and I never once asked him to, but because Elin Fenwick's old coat, the one Davin had brought me years before to have taken in, needed a button replaced, and Davin, still not quite willing to leave the house on ordinary errands more than he had to, had asked Reed to carry it round for him. An errand, I suspect, Davin had invented largely to give the two of us a reason to finally speak. He stood in my doorway turning his cap over in his hands the way an uncertain man does, and I set the kettle on without asking, and somewhere in the space of the 20 minutes it took me to replace one small brass button. He said the thing I think he had been carrying, unspoken, through the whole of that suspension. I keep waiting to feel certain I did right, he told me, not quite looking at me, looking instead at the dress form in the corner of my shop as though it were easier to say the words to a shape with no face than to mine. Everyone keeps telling me I did. The king told me, near enough. But I broke an oath to do it, Miss Wynne, whatever the reason, and I don't know how to hold both of those things at once, that I'm glad I did it, and that I still don't fully know if I was right too. I did not have a clever answer for him, and I have never pretended that I did, in any of the tellings of this story since. I told him only what I actually believed, which was that a man who could hold both of those things at once, uncertainty and gladness together, without letting either one cancel the other out, was very likely exactly the kind of man the Crown ought to want standing at that corner, because a man who felt no uncertainty at all about breaking his post, who found it easy, who felt no weight from it whatsoever, was a man I would trust a good deal less with the next decision like it, whenever it came. I do not know if it helped him. He thanked me for the tea and the button both, and left, and I did not see him again until the inquiry, though the empty cup kept appearing on my sill every morning between then and now. The inquiry itself, when it finally opened in the Assize Hall on Cathedral Row, 6 weeks and 2 days after founding day, was a plainer, quieter thing than the town had built it up to be in its own imagination. I had expected, I think, something closer to a trial, with all the theater that word suggests, and what I got instead was a long paneled room with 3 officers of the Crown seated behind a bench, a clerk taking notes in a hand so fast and so even it seemed almost inhuman, and a slow, careful, unglamorous procession of witnesses called one after another to answer questions that were, for the most part, exactly as dry as the questions inquiries are famous for being. I have already given you the substance of what Alden Cobb said, and the brewery's mechanic, and the yard foreman who wept twice on the stand. Because I told those parts of the story in the order, the events themselves happened rather than the order I actually learned them, which was backward in that hall, out of the mouths of tired and careful men trying to reconstruct a morning none of them had wanted to live through even once. Cormac Reed testified on the second day, and I want to tell you plainly that I have never in my life watched a man so thoroughly refuse to defend himself. The King's Council, for it was, technically, a Crown proceeding, brought not to punish Reed so much as to determine whether the household guard's own standing orders needed to be revisited in light of what had happened, though everyone in that room understood that Reed's own future hung on the answer regardless of how carefully the charge was worded, walked him through every decision of those 4 seconds with a thoroughness that felt, at times, almost cruel in its patience. Why had he not shouted a warning first? Why had he not signaled to a fellow sentry to make the interception instead, preserving his own post? Why had he discarded government property rather than simply setting it down? Whether he had, in the instant he began to run, given any conscious thought at all to the fact that the sovereign himself remained, at that moment, within the theoretical bounds of his protective responsibility. To every question, Reed gave the same kind of answer he had given the king himself on the cobblestones that morning, plain, unembellished, offered without a trace of self-justification. He had not shouted a warning because there had been no time in which a warning could have done anything but startle the boy into stopping where he was, directly in the truck's path, rather than reaching him. He had not signaled to a fellow sentry, because the nearest sentry was 40 yards up the opposite side of the street, and the boy was 3 strides from him and closing. He had discarded the rifle because a rifle held at the port slows a sprinting man by a margin that, over 11 strides, might easily have been the difference between reaching Rory Fenwick and not. And as to the king's safety, he said, in the one answer from that whole examination that I have never been able to forget, I had already seen the outriders take him clear, sir. My eyes don't leave a threat until it's dealt with, but they don't stay on a threat that's already handled, either. That's the whole of what I was trained to do. I was still doing it. I was only doing more of it than my orders technically allowed. There was a long silence after that answer, the kind of silence I have come to understand, from sitting through the whole 3 days of that hearing, meant that something true and difficult to argue with had just been said in a room built for arguing. It was not, in the end, Reed's own testimony that turned the matter, though I believe it weighed heavily with the panel. It was Davin Fenwick, called on the final morning, who I think said the one thing in that entire hearing that made the outcome inevitable, though he did not intend it as a legal argument at all. He was simply, by his own account, too exhausted and too grateful to speak in anything but plain truth by that point in the proceedings. He was asked, toward the end of a gentle and fairly brief examination, whether he held any view on what discipline, if any, the panel ought to recommend for Guardsman Reed. I've thought about little else for 6 weeks, Davin said, and I watched half the room lean forward to hear him, because his voice, though steady, carried the particular weight of a man who has rehearsed a thing many times in his own head and is finally allowed to say it aloud. And I keep coming back to the same place every time. My son is 5 years old today because a man decided, in less time than it takes to say so, that the oath he swore to protect this kingdom's people meant my boy exactly as much as it means the king in his carriage. If you tell me that oath only counts when it's convenient, when it doesn't cost a man his rifle, or his post, or his composure in front of a crowd, then I don't understand what the oath was ever for. I'm not a soldier. I don't know your regulations, and I don't pretend to. I only know that the last thing my son said to that man on the ground, before either of us understood what he'd risked to reach him, was that he wasn't a statue after all. I'd be grateful, sirs, if this kingdom found some way to agree with a 5-year-old boy on that point. King Alaric, who had attended every session of the inquiry from a private gallery at the side of the hall, without comment, and without any visible attempt to influence its proceedings, was seen by several witnesses to lower his head at that testimony in a way more than one person in that room took, rightly or not, for a king quietly agreeing with words he was not permitted, by the very fairness of the process he had insisted upon, to say himself. The panel's finding, delivered on the fourth day to a hall packed well past its ordinary capacity, ran to 11 careful pages, and I will not pretend to remember all of it, but I remember its conclusion nearly word for word, because it was read aloud slowly by the senior officer of the panel, in a voice pitched to carry to the very back of the room. It found that Guardsman Cormac Reed had, in the material particulars, departed from his standing orders as a static route sentry. It found, in the same breath, that his departure had been the product of sound and immediate judgment rather than panic or a failure of discipline, that his assessment of the king's safety before he acted had been accurate and correctly prioritized, and that his conduct in the 4 seconds in question represented, in the panel's own words, not a breach of the discipline this guard exists to instill in its men, but its furthest and truest extension. For the whole purpose of training a man to stand utterly still is so that, when stillness would cost a life, he is the one man on the street capable of knowing it, and moving without an instant's hesitation to prevent it. There would be no disciplinary action of any kind. Guardsman Reed was to be reinstated to full active duty immediately, his suspension formally struck from his record as though it had never been entered, and here the officer paused, and I watched Cormac Reed, standing at attention before the bench in his dress uniform for the first time in 6 weeks, go very still in a different way than I had ever seen him still before, a stillness that had nothing at all of the parade ground in it, the panel recommended. And His Majesty had that same morning confirmed that Guardsman Reed be invested with the Cross of Valor, the kingdom's highest honor for an act of personal courage in the course of duty, in a ceremony to be held at the palace at Harrowgate before the end of that month. The hall did not remain quiet for the reading of that last part. I do not think any hall in the history of the kingdom's inquiries had ever needed to be called to order the way that one did, and I confess I was on my feet with everyone else, clapping until my hands ached, before I had fully registered that I had stood at all. I want to tell you about the investiture, because I was there for that too, along with what felt like half of Harrowgate, packed into the forecourt of the palace at Harrowgate on a bright, cold morning some 3 weeks later, and because I think it is the part of this story that best answers the question people always ask me when I have finished telling the rest of it, which is what became of everyone afterward. The forecourt had been set for a formal investiture, a raised dais at its center draped in the gold and blue of the House of Harrowgate, ranks of the king's household guard drawn up in full ceremonial order along both sides in a display of the very stillness that had made Cormac Reed's 4 seconds of motion so extraordinary in the first place. Row upon row of scarlet and black, rifles at the shoulder, not one man among them so much as blinking in the cold morning air, and I remember thinking, watching them, that I finally understood something about that stillness I had never understood in all my years of walking past it unseeing. It was not emptiness. It was readiness, held perfectly in reserve, the same readiness that had been sitting inside Cormac Reed himself for 2.5 hours on founding day before it was needed, and seeing 100 men hold it at once, in his honor, I felt something in my chest tighten that had nothing at all to do with the cold. Davin and Rory Fenwick stood in a place of honor near the front of the gathered crowd. Rory scrubbed and combed within an inch of his life and wearing, Davin told me afterward with some amusement, a coat he had outgrown by a full inch in the sleeves, because it was the blue one with the brass buttons, and he had refused, with the same flat 5-year-old certainty he brought to everything, to wear any other coat to see his guard receive his medal. He held the king's small enamel pin clipped now to his lapel where the flag had once been, and when Cormac Reed came out onto the dais in his own dress uniform, medals not yet pinned, Rory broke from his father's hand before anyone could stop him and ran the length of the open ground between the crowd and the dais, exactly as he had run 3 months before, though this time toward nothing more dangerous than a man crouching down at once, laughing, to catch him. The officer presiding allowed it. I watched him wave off the guardsman who moved half a step to intercept the boy, and I understood, watching that small permission, that the whole ceremony had quietly agreed, without anyone saying so aloud, to let this one particular piece of protocol bend, in honor of the protocol that had bent so much more dramatically 3 months before. King Alaric himself pinned the Cross of Valor to Cormac Reed's chest, a plain silver cross on a ribbon of gold and blue, small enough that it might have seemed to a stranger an unremarkable piece of metal for all the weight the kingdom placed on it. And I have never forgotten what he said as he did it, because it was not the sort of grand public address I had expected from a king on such an occasion, but something quieter, meant, I think, as much for Reed alone as for the crowd gathered to hear it, though his voice carried clearly enough that all of us did. "I told you, on the day this was earned, that I could not simply thank you," the king said. "I want you to understand that this is not that thanks, either. No ribbon, however old or however rare, discharges what this kingdom owes a man who did what you did. This is only the kingdom's way of telling every other man who will ever stand where you stood, on every corner of every street I will ever process down, what kind of guardsman it hopes he will be if the moment ever asks it of him. You did not fail your post that morning, Guardsman Reed. You were, for 4 seconds, the entire and complete reason a post like yours exists at all." I have heard those words repeated in Harrowgate so many times since, by so many people who were not even present to hear them firsthand, that they have taken on something of the flavor of a proverb in the town, the kind of phrase mothers say to their sons when they complain about a chore that seems to serve no visible purpose. And I confess I have said it myself once or twice, to my own apprentice in the shop, on slow mornings when the work of steady, unglamorous readiness felt like it added up to nothing at all. I watched the ranks of the household guard themselves in the moments just after the king stepped back from the dais, and I want to set down what I saw there too, because it is easy, telling a story like this one, to let it become only a story about one guardsman, one father, one child, and forget the 100 other men standing in formation around them who had spent that whole cold morning holding the same rigid, disciplined stillness Reed himself had held for 2.5 hours on Founding Day. Protocol did not permit them any open display, not during the ceremony itself, and every one of them held his post exactly as trained, chin level, eyes forward, not a man among them so much as shifting his weight. But I saw, in the front rank nearest the dais, a guardsman I later learned had trained alongside Reed from their very first week in the Corps, and in the half-second after the king stepped clear, and before the next formal movement of the ceremony began, I saw that man's eyes flick sideways toward his old friend with an expression that no amount of discipline could fully empty out of a human face. Pride, plain and unguarded, gone again almost as soon as it appeared, but not so quickly that I missed it. I have come to believe in the years since that this was as true and as moving a tribute as anything the king himself said that morning, because it came from men who understood, in a way none of the rest of us watching from the crowd ever fully could, exactly what 4 years of training a body to do nothing at all had cost Cormac Reed to set aside, for 4 seconds, when it mattered. Reed himself, when the ribbon was finally settled and the ceremony's formal business concluded, did not smile the broad, easy smile I might have expected from a younger man freshly hung with the kingdom's highest honor. He stood very straight, eyes forward, the same bearing I had watched him hold at that corner on Mill Hill 100 times before that spring, and it was only when Rory, still gathered against his side, reached up and tugged twice at his sleeve to ask whether the medal meant he was a real soldier now instead of a statue, that something in Reed's composure finally broke open into an expression the whole forecourt could see plainly was joy, unguarded and complete. The first entirely undisciplined thing I had ever watched him allow himself in public. Alden Cobb was there that morning too, at the very back of the crowd, in a plain gray coat, and I want to tell you about him last, because I think his part of the story is the one people are most likely to forget once the ribbon and the king's words have taken up all the room in their memory of it. He had been discharged from hospital within 2 days of the crash, his condition explained fully and sympathetically by his own physician's testimony at the inquiry, and the brewery, to their considerable credit, and I have never heard anyone in Harrowgate speak of Thorne and Sons since, without noting it, had not only kept him on but had, in the weeks following, replaced the entire braking system of every dray in their fleet ahead of schedule. At a cost, the yard foreman told the inquiry, he would gladly pay twice over rather than come that close to losing a child on his own road again. Cobb himself had written to Davin Fenwick within a fortnight of waking in that hospital bed, a letter Davin showed me once, years later, in which he said that he did not expect forgiveness and would understand entirely if none was offered, but that he needed the boy's father to know he thought of Rory Fenwick every single day and would, for the whole of his life, be careful with his own health in a way he had let himself grow careless about. Because he now understood precisely what carelessness could cost people who had done nothing at all to deserve paying for it. Davin had written back a single line, which he also showed me, years later, folded soft at its creases from having been read many times. No one blames you. My son is alive because 2 men, not 1, did everything right in the only seconds either of you were given to do it in. I think that line is as close as I have ever come to understanding the whole of what happened on Harrow High Street that founding day, though I have told the story now more times than I could begin to count. It was not, in the end, a story about a villain and a hero, however much the shape of it, a speeding truck, a child in the road, a guardsman's impossible sprint, might make it sound that way in the retelling. It was a story about an ordinary, careful, unlucky man who did the one right thing left available to him in the last half-second his body gave him, and another ordinary, careful, extraordinary man who had spent 4 years training himself to be ready for a half-second he never expected would come, and a 5-year-old boy who, faced with a world suddenly full of noise and fear, ran not away from danger in blind panic, but toward the one thing on the whole street that had ever looked to him like safety, and was right to. I want to close this the way I have found myself closing it every time I have told it since, which is not with the medal, and not even with the king's words on that cold forecourt morning, but with what became of the years that came after, because I think a story like this one is only truly finished once you know it did not simply end at its own most dramatic moment and leave everyone standing there forever, frozen at the height of it, the way a painting would. Cormac Reed did not ask for a quieter posting after the Cross of Valor was pinned to his chest, though I am told more than one of his superiors offered him the choice of it, gently, in case 4 seconds on Harrow High Street had left him wanting distance from a route sentry's post for the rest of his career. He asked instead to go back to the same corner at Mill Hill, and got it, and stood it for another 6 years after that morning, through founding days that came and went without incident, through ordinary gray Tuesdays when nothing happened at all, which is, after all, what the post is built for, and what it delivers mercifully on the overwhelming majority of the mornings any guardsman ever stands it. He was made a sergeant of the household guard the year Rory Fenwick turned 11, and I am told, by men who would know, that when the young guardsmen under him asked why a decorated man with a Cross of Valor to his name chose to spend 6 more years standing still at a rope line instead of pursuing whatever grander postings the honor might have opened to him, he tells them, more or less, what he told the inquiry: that a route sentry's whole use to the crown is being the one man on a street who is watching closely enough, for long enough, without ever once looking as though he is watching at all, to notice the one morning in 1,000 when it matters, and that having been that man once, he saw no reason at all to stop being him. The horse trough on the corner of Mill Hill and Harrow High Street was never removed, though the town council debated it more than once in the years after, some arguing that the dent left in its stone flank by the truck's buckled axle was an ugly thing to leave standing on the kingdom's own procession route. Others, and this argument won out in the end, by a fairly wide margin, arguing that the dent was the truest monument Harrowgate was ever likely to build to what discipline and ordinary courage together could accomplish in 4 seconds, and that it ought to stand exactly as it was left, unpolished and unexplained to any tourist who happened to ask about it, known and understood only by the town itself. There is no plaque. I have always thought that was right. The people who need to know what happened on that corner already know, and the people who don't will simply see an old stone trough with a dent in it, on an old street in an old town, and go on their way none the poorer for not knowing, which is, in its own manner, exactly how a town like ours prefers to keep its own history carried, rather than displayed. Davin Fenwick never remarried, though I have it on good authority, from more than one source in this town who enjoys speculating about such things rather more than I do myself, that he and a widow who kept the flower stall by the cathedral steps have grown considerably closer in the years since, close enough that I would not be at all surprised, one of these founding days, to see them stand at that rope together rather than at opposite ends of the street. He still builds barrels the old way, stave by stave, and he still closes the cooperage every founding day morning to walk his son down to the procession route, though Rory is nearly grown now, tall and a little solemn in the particular way that boys who have lived through something enormous at an age too young to fully understand it often grow up to be. Not sad. I want to be clear, never sad, but thoughtful in a way that sets him slightly apart from other boys his age, a boy who has known, since he was 5 years old, exactly what it costs a person to be brave for someone else, because he watched a stranger pay that cost for him in the open street and has never once, in all the years since, forgotten it. He still keeps the king's enamel pin. I have seen it myself, more than once, worn on the collar of whatever coat he happens to be wearing that season, moved carefully from garment to garment as he has outgrown them one after another, the single steadiest object in a boy's wardrobe that has otherwise changed size 4 or 5 times over since the morning he first received it. And Rory Fenwick and Cormac Reed, against every expectation either of them might reasonably have had about how such a friendship could survive the difference in their ages and their stations, remained close. Reed taught him, over the years that followed, to stand at proper attention as a kind of game between them that Rory took with far more seriousness than any game deserves. And later, when the boy was old enough to ask the harder questions a growing boy eventually asks about a morning that shaped the whole of his childhood, Reed answered them plainly, the same way he had answered every question the inquiry ever put to him, without embellishment and without false modesty either, because I think he understood, better than most men would have in his position, that a boy who owes his life to a stranger's 4 seconds of courage deserves the truth of those 4 seconds exactly as they happened, not a softened or a heightened version built for a child's comfort. I asked Rory once myself, a few years ago now, on one of the many occasions he has wandered into my shop the way his father used to, whether he remembered any of it clearly, whether 5 years old was old enough to have kept the morning whole in his memory, or whether it had come to him mostly second-hand, the way it comes to most people who hear this story only after the fact, stitched together out of other people's accounts. He thought about it for a long moment, in the same grave, careful way his father always used to consider a question before answering it, and then he told me that what he remembered most clearly, more clearly even than the sound of the truck or the crash itself, was the exact instant he had looked up while running and seen Cormac Reed's arms already opening to catch him, before he had covered even half the distance between them. I wasn't scared anymore the second I saw that, he told me. I know that sounds impossible because the truck was still coming, but I wasn't. I just knew I was going to be caught. I have thought about that answer more than almost anything else in this whole long story, in all the years I have been telling it, because I think it says something true not only about Cormac Reed, and not only about that one bright, terrible, extraordinary founding day morning, but about the entire strange, quiet, unglamorous purpose of every guardsman who has ever stood a post like his, motionless for hours at a stretch, watched by crowds who mostly walk past without truly seeing them. The way I myself walked past Cormac Reed 100 times before that spring without ever once wondering what kind of man stood inside the uniform. The stillness was never the point of him. It never is for any of them. It is only the shape discipline takes while it waits, quietly and for as long as it must, for the one moment it was always truly for. I still keep the shop on Harrow High Street, though I am considerably grayer now than I was that spring, and I still dress the window for Founding Day every year in whatever colors the committee has settled on. And I still, if I am honest with you, glance up toward the corner at Mill Hill more often than I used to on an ordinary morning, out of a habit I never quite managed to unlearn. Cormac Reed retired from active posting 3 years ago, older now himself, though he still comes back every Founding Day to stand, unofficially and entirely by his own choice, near that same corner among the crowd rather than in the ranks, a spectator now where he was once a sentry, and Davin and Rory always find him there, and more often than not, so do I, and the four of us stand together for a few minutes before the band comes into hearing, saying very little. Because there is very little left, after all these years, that any of us still need to say about it out loud. I have told this story so many times now, to visitors passing through the shop who ask about the dent in the old stone trough on the corner, to my own apprentice on slow mornings, to anyone at all who will stand still long enough to hear the whole of it properly told, and I find that I do not tire of it the way I once thought I might, the way you tire of a story worn thin by too much retelling. I think that is because it is not, in the end, a story about a single extraordinary morning at all, however extraordinary that morning truly was. It is a story about what a great many quiet, unremarkable, disciplined mornings are secretly for, about the particular, unglamorous, essential courage of standing very still, for years at a stretch, so that on the one morning it finally matters, you are already exactly where you need to be. I remember the sound the truck made coming down that hill, and I expect I always will. But what I remember more clearly now, after all these years of telling it, is the sound that came after, the sound of an entire street breathing again, all at once, because a man who was never supposed to move had moved anyway, in the 4 seconds his whole life had quietly prepared him for, and reached a frightened child before the worst of the world could.